Holy Happy Hour, Batman. That's right. This is the second episode in our very special 2-episode for the price of one. You could say happy hour special if you like bad jokes. If you're new, if you're just joining me for the first time here in the second hour, we're doing 2 episodes back to back tonight. We don't usually do that. I'm Father Ben, or Ben is fine. I'm an Episcopal priest, gamer, streamer, podcast host, and co-founder of the All Ports Open Network. On this show, I'm joined by heroes of the gaming and geek world to talk about life, faith, spirituality, and whatever else comes up. Folks, I am thrilled beyond reckoning, honestly, to welcome our guest for this next segment tonight. We'll be joined in just a few minutes by James D'Amato, host of the podcasts One Shot and Campaign, and the author of the new book, The Ultimate RPG Game Master's Worldbuilding Guide, which is available now wherever books are sold. On this show, I also like to share cocktail recipes for happy hour, of course, inspired by my guests. And so I've had a few weeks to think about the cocktails we're going to do for this episode because we rescheduled James. And I've been thinking about it for over a month. And lots of different cocktail recipes have bounced around in my head. But I sort of settled, at least for now, on 2. And I'm going to share them real quickly before we bring James on the show. James and I have a lot to talk about, I'm sure. But I want to share these 2 with you. They're both inspired, I guess, by Speir, the world of Skyjacks. And so the first one, this is what I'm drinking right now. It's called Sky Grog. It was my attempt to make a Skyjacks drink. It's literally what I'm drinking. I was going for a sky color. It's kind of green. You can see the recipe on the screen right now. It's basically a grog recipe with blue curacao in it. If you're interested in that kind of thing. I made another drink. I think it's apropos of the conversation we're going to have. It is inspired by the Church of the Slain God. And so I just called it that. I called it the Slain God. And it's another pirate type drink. It's basically a zombie with some alterations that I made. Some dangerous alterations because I used 2 ounces of black blended overproof rum and salt to taste. I wanted it to be a little salty. I figured that was fitting for the Church of the Slain God. So 2 fun drinks. I'll put them on Twitter. If you follow me on Twitter, you can find them there afterward. I'll find other places to put them up if you want them. 2 drinks inspired by Skyjacks. So that's basically all the housekeeping stuff that I had before we're going to bring James on. So let me put the drinks away, and let's go ahead and bring James on the show. James, I'm going to have to fix you. You're slightly out. There we go. Perfect. James, welcome to the show. Welcome to Holy Happy Hour, Batman.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. And hello, heroes, to everybody out there watching.
Yeah. So if I already kind of introduced you by talking about what you do, but do you want to, in case someone's watching and they don't know who you are, do you want to tell them a little bit about yourself?
Of course. My name is James D'Amato. I am the president of the One Shot Podcast Network and hosts of the One Shot and Campaign Skyjacks podcasts. Over on One Shot, I explore as many different role-playing systems as I possibly can. We've been going for many, many years now. We have over 400 episodes, and we have shown off some truly incredible role-playing games there. If you are curious about games, especially those outside of the big brand games like D&D, I highly recommend One Shot. It's a great place to discover something new. If you like storytelling, and especially long-form audio storytelling, I also recommend checking out Campaign Skyjacks, a thing that I think we're going to be talking about a lot tonight. It is a show set in a world inspired by folk tales and the music of the Decemberists. It is a story that we tried to design to be anti-colonialist and anti-capitalist, and it's about sky pirates. I really, really love what we're doing with the world building and storytelling there. I think of the many things that I do, it's probably what I'm proudest of.
And you do a lot, including write several of these Ultimate Guide books. So there's a lot of stuff there. I've been thinking a lot about where to dig in, and I've just keep circling around because I have so many different avenues I want to dig in with you. But I'll just say before we do that, my first episode of One Shot I ever listened to was actually Deadlands Noir.
Okay.
And that was the first time I listened to One Shot. and I was a Deadlands fan, right? But through One Shot, I've definitely found many more smaller games. That was sort of around the time when I was like really starting to then just discover all these indie RPGs. And I mean, I'm sure that most of the folks watching are fans. They know about One Shot. But you know, if you don't listen to One Shot and you're interested in, it is really the best avenue I know to like really explore and experience like what is this game like in case I might want to run it, you know, in my own home or check it out or buy it or whatever. It is just a really lovely introduction to so many different games.
Thank you.
And then also, I also wanted to mention, because of the timing here, that there's another game in the world, or show in the world of Speir, right?
That's true. Yes. Yeah. So we are going to be talking about campaign Skyjacks, which is set in the world of Speir. And the One Shot Podcast Network actually has a spin-off show also set in Speir called Skyjacks Courier's Call. And that is an all ages approach to the world that we've built. There's a lot to love in there, and we are currently kickstarting our second season of that show. And that Kickstarter is in its final hours. Yeah. It will end probably while we are on this stream together.
I actually have it up on my screen so I could check in on it because Kickstarter is a little vague, right? And I was like, well, it says 2 hours. Let's see what it says right now. Oh yeah, it's going to end in 49 minutes. So it'll be this is perfect. We are we're counting down the last minutes of the Kickstarter, folks. You have a chance to. I'll even link it in the chat if folks want to go and back it before it's done. Courier's Call is awesome. My kids are. I was telling James before the show. My kids are huge fans of the show. Listen to Courier's Call. I'm going to give the first question I have to my son, who was a fan of Courier's Call. This is not like the other questions we're going to talk about tonight, but it's the one he asked me. Because I sometimes I like to say, you know, Nathan, do you have something you want me to ask somebody? And usually the topics are over his head, but like, you know, he listens to Courier's Call, so he knows about Speir. And his question was, are all pirates criminals?
That is a really interesting question, especially because of the structure of Speir. And I apologize if this is information that will go over a 4-year-old's head.
All right.
The short answer, like in my opinion, no. The reason that pirates are outcasts or outlaws in our world is because the Red Feather Syndicate dictates what can be done with featherweave. Featherweave, for those that aren't aware of the world of Skyjacks, is a substance that allows the sky ships that we have in our setting to fly. Basically, it is a material that when it's exposed to heat will become lighter than air, and also it will try to get away from that heat, which allows the ships to propel themselves. It's extremely valuable because it's a material that, makes the sky shipping industry possible. And it is only manufactured and produced by the Red Feather Syndicate. It is whatever methods used to produce it are secret, and those secrets are held very closely to, the highest members of the Red Feather Syndicate. And a couple decades ago in that setting, the Red Feather Syndicate declared that all featherweave that they had previously sold still in some way belonged to the syndicate. And at the time, there was a conflict between people who, had legitimately bought this weave and the syndicate itself. They fought a big battle over it. And the conclusion to that was the syndicate agreed that it would honor all previous bills of sale that they had issued of featherweave, and that anybody who flies with featherweave using a bill of sale is called a privateer, someone that privately owns their ship and the weave on it. The Red Feather Syndicate these days no longer sells featherweave. Instead, they just make ships that they control and use their own industry. Anybody who is sailing a sky ship without a bill of sale issued by the Red Feather Syndicate is considered a corsair. And according to their corporate policies, they are an outlaw. So, in a sense, if you really respect and care about what the Red Feather Syndicate has to say, then yes, you'd consider these folks criminals. In towns that are friendly with or completely controlled by the Red Feather Syndicate, Corsairs would not be welcome. There would be a system of punishment and laws that the Red Feathers would put in place for anybody who is using their weave without their permission. But who knows if the Red Feathers are the only people who can actually make feather weave? Who knows under what circumstances bills of sale might have been lost or, discarded or not respected. So many things. I think a big thing to question about when we talk about criminals, especially in the setting of Speir, is who is writing the laws that say people are criminals and why do they benefit? And that might be a good question to carry with us into real life as well.
Maybe that is part of the design, right? It's almost as if you intended that question when you were world building. I'm really curious, and again, we're going to mostly, I think, be digging into the religious influences on Speir, but I am now curious from a world building standpoint because I do world building myself, and you've obviously just written a book about it. But you said, "Who knows if?"
Yes,
which is a question. I love that question. Who knows if? I love that question. The question I have is, do you know? And that kind of touches on a broader question about the way you world build, but but the basic form of that question is like, do you know?
The answer to that is mostly because the stories that we're telling in both Skyjacks and Courier's Call are living stories. They are evolving stories. They're not done yet. I don't know what needs I'll have, a couple years down the road. And so committing to certain things, doesn't behoove you as a storyteller, especially if that story is improvisational. Nailing certain things in place. I think if you're going to put something in place, you should be doing it through action and through story. And deciding too much, before rubber hits the road on some of that storytelling can put you in a tight spot later. There are a few decisions that I have made from a storytelling perspective that I'm like, I really wish I hadn't put myself in that box. I didn't think that through enough. It would have been more convenient for me to have things shake out a different way. So, for the most part, for the core structure of the story, I do think that the Red Feathers are the only ones who are producing what we know as like traditional feather weave. Recently in the show, and spoilers for folks who might be far back, we've encountered a different kind of feather weave. And right now, the PCs have absolutely no idea where that feather weave came from, how, obviously how it's made or who might have produced it. I do know the answer to that question, but, do I want to boldly declare that every ship in the sky sailing with traditional feather weave, came from the Syndicate? And the answer is I don't know. I think so, and I think that's the thing that most people believe, but there are always reasons to put exceptions into your storytelling. That's one of the fun things about putting a rule in place is, you get to decide when and how and if you break it.
And so much of the world building you do is with your players, which is one of the things I'm enamored by listening. It's one of the things that I push myself when I listen to campaign to remember to do more. And then actually, in fairness, when I'm listening to myself editing an actual play, I'm like, oh, I am doing more of that than I remember. But I'm constantly just enamored by the shared world building nature of the way you do campaign. And so I'm curious, when you decided to do Speir, when you decided to do Skyjacks, how much of that was you? How much of that was collaborative? Where, how did that process go of saying, okay, we're going to switch to from a very, very beloved campaign with Star Wars, and we're going to switch to Skyjacks. And then what was that process like?
I mean, boy, that process, the whole, I describe the first half of campaign Skyjacks sometimes as us surviving things as a company that we really shouldn't have been able to survive. We had one of the founding and core partners of the company depart, and rather quickly, at a point where we couldn't really conclude the extremely beloved series that we were in the middle of producing. And, looking at my company and our income, something needed, another ongoing project needed to replace that project, which, was an incredibly intimidating prospect, because campaign Star Wars was incredible. It was so well run. The characters were so much fun. The thought of replacing that, like, even today, being on the other side of it and having survived, like, it's daunting.
Yeah.
So, like, in that campaign Star Wars, I think stylistically was very different than campaign Skyjacks, partially because I think my style as a GM and Kat's style as a GM are informed by different traditions and preferences. I have a heavy improv background, and I really, really love collaboration and feed off of it. And like, I play in that space a lot more effectively. Especially like with the years that I had spent running One Shot, I had come to depend on collaboration. Like, so many of our series on One Shot depend on the group of players sitting down together and doing a tiny bit of world building, like, crossing some wires in our character creation to get things going. And I always felt like it took the games in a really rewarding place. And I knew it would be a big mistake for me to step into, Kat's shoes as a GM and try to present the show in the way they would. I don't think I could possibly be successul in, like, because, like, you don't want to do a bad impression of Kat. Like, I'd much rather, put put my voice and the way I handle things in front of people and let them either take it or leave it. So with that, I was like, okay, I want to have a group of players that I really trust, and whose ideas that I want to sit with and honor. And like, we had known behind the scenes that the campaign Star Wars might be coming to an end soon-ish. So Johnny and JPC had actually talked about, if we're not going to be doing campaign Star Wars anymore, we got to figure out what we're going to do. And the idea that they had come up with was pretty simple and straightforward. It was just Sky Pirates. They wanted to do something with Sky Pirates. And so, like, we had met outside of the IO Improv Theater, a place that sadly no longer exists, and talked about, like, kind of what we were thinking. And they brought me this Sky Pirates idea, and I was like, okay, we'll think about it. And to me, when I think about pirates, I think about the Decemberists, and like, that is the thing that I found most appealing about it. Like, for those that don't know the cultural context for somebody who is in my particular age generation, like, when I grew up in high school, the Pirates of the Caribbean movies were friggin' huge. They were like enormous, unstoppable cultural forces. And they were the sort of thing that took over, like, the pop culture landscape to the point that a couple years after they had fallen out of favor, they felt like kind of hokey and like almost embarrassing. So, like, I didn't have a lot of warm feelings about pirate stuff. So I was like trying to challenge myself and like, okay, how do I find something that I'm interested in the idea of Sky Pirates? How do I present this idea in a way that I can be invested in and care about? And, like I said, I'm a fan of the Decemberists. Johnny was also a huge fan of the Decemberists. So I took that to Johnny and JPC and be like, I kind of want to base our world building around this music and some of the stories that are buried in this music, and by association, the board game by Together Studios, or card game, I should say, by Together Studios, Illimat, which was designed by Keith Baker in conjunction with the Decemberists themselves.
Right.
And they agreed to it, and that sort of became the basic building blocks of what we tried to do on Campaign Skyjacks. Is I was not just collaborating with, my fellow players, Johnny, JPC, Tyler, and Liz. I was collaborating with the Decemberists, using them as a foundational influence. And then a step further from that, I was like incorporating the folk stories and, mythological traditions and the other cultural traditions that the Decemberists and their music, paid attention to and featured and cared about. So when we sat down for our initial session 0, where we made the characters that would become the characters on the show, we were going through a collaborative process where, based on everybody's characters, I wanted to find space in the world to support their choices and support them. The recording, we haven't released it yet because, first of all, I don't know what the quality is going to end up being like, because we didn't have great mic discipline during all of that. But I'm sure it'll still be interesting. But when we sat down to make everybody's characters, their character choices had large implications about what the setting would allow and thought was interesting. JPC said that he wanted to be a necromancer. And I was like, okay, necromancy can be important in this world. Do you want necromancy to be a common thing or an uncommon thing? Do you want to be doing something that is, generally accepted, or something that is generally frowned upon? And there was another trouser leg of history where I was talking to JPC, and I'm like, if this is a common thing, one of the aesthetics that we can fold into our setting is necropunk. We can literally have muscles and sinews and organs and whatnot be part of how the ships move and whatnot. And JPC settled on wanting it to be forbidden and wanting it to be a secret that his character kept. So that was discarded, and we ended up, necromancy is kind of a taboo that is culturally forbidden in many different places across Speir. So they could have also both Johnny and Liz, had characters that I'm not going to describe as non-human, but aren't human in a traditional sense. They have some supernatural power to them and background to them. We didn't know in the beginning how much humanoid characters we wanted in the world. I think I asked several times through that world building process, do we want elves and dwarves and stuff?
Yeah.
What sort of fantasy do we want for this world? What do we find appealing about it? So, we had kind of settled on the things that Johnny and Liz are uncommon. And also not exactly not human either. So it was just a really interesting and collaborative process. But the core of it is I wanted whatever we're doing with the world, whatever we're doing with the story, I want it to say something about and, place at its center the characters of the people who are going to be performing on the show. And, I made other decisions based on the themes that I was pulling from the music of the Decemberists and the folk tales that they were interacting with. I really wanted to hit a particular mood for the story that kind of wistful call to adventure, a sad sailor picking up their bags and getting on a ship to do hard work because there's really no other options in life, and it's dangerous, but it's also a little bit exciting and romantic and so much of that. So yeah, heavily collaborative process, unavoidably collaborative process. I could not have done what we did to build Speir alone. If I had, it wouldn't be as interesting or wouldn't be as fun, I don't think, because it is a bunch of really good ideas balanced against each other, making a solid foundation for the world and story that we're telling.
Yeah, in the last hour, we were talking a little bit about designing for player experiences versus like other ways of designing, which I wasn't thinking of in the context of like world building until you were just talking. But, you know, now that you talk about that, like it is interesting because I think whenever I sit down as a GM to like, okay, I'm going to start a new game, I think about my players, like, and I think about their characters. Like, I really like that character-centric approach to world building to say, like, what are the decisions they're making? And then how does that interact with the larger world that we're going to build? Because, like, otherwise, I mean, they are the center, like, they're the center of the experience for sure. They might not be the center of the world from, like, an objective standpoint if you're, like, building a whole world around them, that, like, they aren't the center of that world necessarily. They're in the world, but certainly they're the center of all of the experiences that you're going to have in the world. So to design with them in mind, I mean, it just makes a tremendous amount of sense to me.
It is. I'm sure there are other ways to approach world building, but I would not be good at them. That's for sure.
So I want to pivot to sort of the meat and potatoes of the show. And I want to talk about religion in Speir and Skyjacks because it's very fascinating. If folks want a taste of, if they don't listen to campaign, but they really want a taste of like an idea of like, ooh, what is this world? What's religion doing in this world? Or at least one religion in this world. There's such a great little audio. It's like 3 minutes long. And I should have had it up on the screen because I can't remember what it's called. I'm sure you know that.
I think it's probably just called Church of the Slain God.
Yeah, what are those called? What is that series called though?
Tales from Speir.
Tales from Speir. Church of the Slain God, I think it is called. If folks want like a really immersive taste of religion in the world of Speir, it's really cool and worth listening to, and it's like 3 minutes long. But
yeah, I have dropped that in the chat for everybody to check.
Awesome. It's very evocative. I have a lot of questions about Church of the Slain God, but I don't know if you think it's more interesting to talk about like how you decide to approach religion generally with world building for this world, or whether you want to jump into this. I mean, because we could go either way because I have so many questions.
Let's preface this with a talk about like the general role of like not even just religion, but culture in the world of Speir. Yeah. One of the things that I mentioned up top with what we're trying to do with this show is we want it to be an anti-colonial bit of storytelling. One of the things about piracy, it is so deeply tied to the story of colonialism in our world. Like when people think about the golden age of piracy, or I think the most common, excuse me.
It's fine.
1 moment.
No problem. I presume James will be right back. We'll stall. I can actually, you know what I'll do? I know what I'll do. Real quick, while James is taking that call, if I have enough time, you might have heard some really awesome music before James and I came on. And that's because, here, he's coming back. Hold that thought about the music. I will tell you all about that later. James is back. Hey, James, welcome back.
I am so sorry.
No, you're fine.
That was an electrician that. Anyway, so like piracy is deeply tied to colonialism, like especially I think stereotypical pirate people think of as a European pirate. I don't want to paint with too broad a brush because, piracy is everywhere. Like it still exists today all over the world, even naval piracy. But like I think, at least in the United States, a lot of the ideas of the pop culture pirate is a European pirate around the age where, European settlers are coming to the Americas and, doing terrible, terrible things. And pirates had a interesting place in that story, kind of like being both a part of and a reaction and resistance to some of the terrible things that European colonizers were doing. Anyway, like the reason that we wanted to center anti-colonialism in our storytelling is primarily that we didn't want to glorify the bad things that happened at that time. And also it feels like so much of the storytelling that you encounter in a Western pop culture world excuses or incorporates colonialism in a way that is benign, or, you know, even in glorifying it in different ways. And I feel like you look around at the modern world and see so many of like the truly awful results of colonialism, the ways that it has hurt people, torn cultures apart, and made the world extremely unpleasant to live in, you know, in a modern age, like things that happened hundreds of years ago, or even, you know, over 1,000 years ago, where we're still feeling the negative effects of those things, and telling stories that excuse and glorify those awful actions. So if we're going to tell a new story in this time period, I did not want that story to be one that became part of that problem. And especially because we're dealing with like things that revolve around one of the larger like pieces of the history of colonialism. Like, I wanted to like, okay, let's take a look at that, own that, pay attention to it, and provide a narrative that feels satisfying, and also points out some of like the bad things that happened in the past, and, you know, empowers the audience to feel like they can react to those things, and, you know, give a good feelings, a bit of escapism, and make, you know, the complicated mess of problems that makes up colonialism small enough that you feel like you could actually overcome and defeat them. So that mission is pretty core to what we're doing in the world, or what we're trying to do. Like I say all the time, I don't know how successful we'll be at this. I, you know, am a white colonizer descended from white colonizers. You know, I'm probably not the best person to do this, but like, if I'm going to tell any story, I want to try my darndest to make sure that it is a good story that is at least more helpful than the stories that I grew up with. So because we have that core mission baked into the world, how I want to talk about and represent different ideas changes, which means when I look at something like religion, it has to be broken down into different forces and different experiences and ways that people interact with it. If you're going to be anti-colonial, you need to like have an admiration for and respect and love for culture. So you can't dunk on religion necessarily, because that is an important part of like what makes up people's cultural experiences. And even if parts of it, as I'll talk about, are, you know, aspects of colonialism, like you can't really invalidate somebody's identity like that. So religion, you know, as a product of culture, as a cultural force, like that's something that we want to uphold and respect and be conscientious of. Religion also, at least organized religions, has this overlap and intersection with government, especially my cultural religion, the Catholic Church. I am Irish and Italian in my ancestry. So both sides of that means the Catholic Church is extremely important cultural force to my history, and had a big influence on it. And I feel a lot of ways about it, and those feelings are extremely complicated because of the colonial force that like the Catholic Church has been pretty much throughout its entire run. As a cultural thing, there are things that I appreciate about my Catholic upbringing. Like there are some compelling stories, compelling rituals, compelling traditions that come from that really inform, you know, my perspective on the world, my family experience, you know, just a lot. And a lot of that is stuff that, you know, I don't view as negative and might even view as positive or view fondly in some way. However, there is the larger problem of like the governmental entity that is the Catholic Church and the ways in which it has failed its, what am I trying to say? I don't know if it's parishioners or congregation, perhaps the ways that it has failed its worshipers, and the ways that it has like almost intentionally harmed the world, and the ways that its leaders have harmed the world, kind of against the core philosophies that the church espouses. So, if there are Catholic folks out there who are listening to me talk about the Catholic Church as a negative force, like I can understand that being kind of an emotional experience, especially if you, like me, have a very like deep cultural history tied to Catholicism. When I talk about things like that, I'm referring to things like the Medici, and what they did in the Catholic Church, and how, regardless of what you think of our current Pope and the current archdiocese and all of that, there were things that were done with the power of the Catholic Church in the name of, the God of the Catholic Church that are abominable. And like, we can own that while still prioritizing our own, cultural experience and respecting that cultural experience. But I think you kind of have to, if you want to live in a good and virtuous world. You have to encounter and rebuke that evil, as it were.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, listen, I'm an Anglican, not a Catholic, right? And so, talk about baggage, colonial baggage. We're a colonial church. I mean, everywhere where there is an Anglican communion province, it's because England was a colonizer there, and so we wrestle with that. We're still wrestling with that several hundred years later, and we'll probably continue to wrestle with that as to what it means to our identity. What does it mean to be Anglican, when being Anglican at all is in some ways a remnant of colonialism. So it's definitely a wrestle.
Like looking at if you look at the colonial story of like just the Irish side of my family, for instance, if you were coming from Ireland, especially to the United States around like the 20s, you are coming over, and Catholicism is probably a very big part of your cultural history. But as an Irish person, like leaving your homeland and whatnot, the Catholic Church, isn't really native to that area. The Catholic Church in and of itself is an artifact of colonialism. When I went to Ireland as an adult and went to, different cultural museums and whatnot that they had around there, it was striking to me that my family came over to the United States without any stories of Irish mythology, without any stories about Irish history really being important to us, but a lot of Catholicism. Because colonizers came to Ireland and imposed this religion on the native folks there until it became a foundational element of culture in that area. Then later on, Catholicism fell out of favor as Protestants took over England, and suddenly being Catholic was not welcome there. And that sort of like raging force, like, it's still a conflict that is prescient to this day. Like that pushed people, and oppression related to that conflict pushed people off of their native land to the United States. And what did they carry with them? Well, they carried with them the culture that, hundreds of years ago was forced upon them. And to assimilate here in the United States, they had to abandon a lot of things or hide a lot of things that were related to any aspect of their culture. We didn't have a Catholic. We've had two Catholic presidents. In the entire run of the United States, we've had two Catholic presidents. And when Kennedy was running for the presidency, the fact that he was Catholic was an issue,
right? And
that carried well into the 1960s. So if you look at that cultural story, that is a huge tangled mess at a certain point, like as an Irish person or a Catholic person, you are fighting for your identity, but the identity that you're fighting for, you're having to do on foreign soil that you are colonizing because of oppression that you faced on your home soil. That was also tainted by a colonial push by someone else hundreds of years ago. So it is a wild and complicated and deeply sad thing to think about. But, it also brings us to, what we have today. And like, I certainly love the Irish side of my family, and I love the culture that we do have. And, it's something that, like, if you engage with it and you engage with it conscientiously, like, it can bring you real joy. So that sort of thing, that wild, massive, complicated story, is something that I wanted to talk about in Speir, and talk about through our storytelling. But I also kind of wanted to have fun with it. One of the things, because religion is something that, we do care about and we do respect so much in our culture, you are not allowed to have a lot of fun thinking about your religion around people with religious authority, because it flirts with blasphemy and heresy quite often if you do. So I also wanted, the freedom to look at the underlying, because Catholicism has so much of a role in colonialism and in colonialist behavior. I wanted to grapple with it as a cultural force, and also think about the underlying themes of the scripture, taught in the Catholic Church, sort of versus the results of that, and look at kind of the, almost governmental structures that enable that sort of thing to go into place, which leads us to the Church of the Slain God. So after that long statement, we're finally there together.
Yeah, one thing I just want to comment on that I was thinking of when you were just talking was how much of a shame that is, what you said about having fun with, I always tell people as a priest in a parish, if you're not having fun, why are we even bothering to do this thing that we're doing? Why are you even coming here if you're not enjoying yourself? But also, I'm just thinking about how when I had Alex Roberts on a couple of months ago, way back in April, one of the things we were talking about back then was just how the space of religion and the space of play is the same space, right? I like to think of this as in a psychological sense, and it's the same sort of interpsychic space of religion and play. And so the idea that that you're doing religious activity and you're not playing, to me, the way I think about religion is just so foreign and so odd. The idea that you can't have fun with it. Maybe what I'm getting at is that it's a shame that so much of maybe people in the institutional church, or so many people in positions like mine, have reinforced this idea that you can't have lots of fun with this. You certainly can't play. If you play with this too much, you'll cross lines. And that's exactly the idea of what that space is meant to do. It's meant to let you play in, just like role-playing games do, just to play in the space, to get messy, to see what happens.
Yeah. I mean, also at some point, and I don't know much about the history of the church and its various offspring and branches and whatnot, but at some point we nailed down these ideas too in a weird way. If you think about Apocrypha and religious scholarship and things like that, for a very long time people were essentially writing half canon fan fiction of the Bible. I think all the time about how for the longest time, if you were a person of a certain economic privilege, and you had a nerdy personality, and the way that we think of nerdy personality today, where we obsess today over superheroes and video games and role-playing games and whatnot. It used to be, in certain segments of Europe, if you were going to be nerdy about something, literally the only thing you could really safely be nerdy about was religion. you could memorize all the saints that there had been and all of their stories, and like you talk about which stories were canon and which stories weren't canon and which stories should be included and which shouldn't. And some people would write pretty compelling fan fiction about biblical figures that today has been canonized or semi-canonized as canonical like stuff. It is a wild thing, but like we're not allowed to do that today. We're not allowed to sit and have a think and go, I wonder what other stuff Peter did.
I think it did. Yeah. So yeah, I think it's really funny, by the way, thinking of hagiography as like world building, medieval like world building and role playing games, which it kind of is. But depending on who you ask, I think as far as now, right? Because like I do think that there is some spiritual traditions that's exactly like in Ignatian spirituality. It's exactly what you're invited to do. It's like, is use your imagination to enter into a story that's, it might be in the Bible, but it's so like non-fundamentalist ways of using, say the canon of scripture or other things or theology to like explore and play in the space. But I want to talk about the Church of the Slain God since we finally got there. I'm curious as to like what your thought process was I'm curious because when I hear stuff that has to do with the Church of the Slain God, I have sort of where my mind goes as to like, and it's pretty much what you just spelled out, which is like, okay, this is the Catholic. To me, when I think of the Church of the Slain God, I think, okay, this is the Catholic Church in a world where there are sky pirates and where the fall happened. But I am curious as to like what you were doing, what your intentionality was with the Church of the Slain God.
Yeah. So like one of the big reasons that the Church of the Slain God is an important force, like apart from my desire to explore colonialism through the lens of the Catholic Church, is that one of the primary party members of our group, Gable, played by Liz Anderson, Liz decided that she wanted Gable to be a fallen angel. Like, I think that was even like one of the options for character archetypes in the Genesis book. Like, I don't know. I can't remember what prompted that initially, but that became the result of it, was that Gable's a fallen angel, which gave me as a game master and like somebody doing a lot of the world building permission to go, okay, let's look at, for lack of a better term, Catholic mythology. Let's look at the story behind like the lessons. Let's treat the things that are in the Bible that some people would claim metaphorically. Let's treat them as events in history, and let's have fun by building an alternate history out of that. Now, people who maybe have a different relationship with religion than I do might call that blasphemy, and that I'll own that. There is some of that, because like one of and this is going to get into some spoiler territory. Like, okay. That can't be avoided. There's not going to be spoilers for the future stuff in the show, even though there are a lot of like really important things that I can't talk about because of that. But okay. Gable is a fallen angel who was cast down because like in the apocryphal story of our world history and in the Bible, there was a clash between rebellious angels, rebellious forces, and God and God's faithful servants. And in the world of Speir, God died. But did not necessarily lose the fight, as those rebellious forces were cast down from heaven. So I wanted to like look at that and just take a different look at kind of how the structure of the mythology might change around that, and what ways that could empower us to do some interesting thematic world building. Because the sovereign, which is what we call the god in Speir, because the sovereign was struck down, the world of Speir and like the angels were cast out of the absent heavens, like the world of Speir took a real hit and doesn't function properly anymore. In Speir, seasons don't flow in order. The water levels rose, and the seas got filled with terrible monsters. And there's so much, like, there's like a horrible curse in the water. There's so many terrible things like wandering around the world. It is post-cataclysmic and in a lot of ways post-apocalyptic. Because of all that, because the world is so bad, if you had an established religion that was worshiping this god, and especially like if it is, I imagine in Speir, before the fall, the relationship that people had to their religion wasn't too dissimilar from our world, or the world of, like, you know, like around the Renaissance, in that people are very culturally tied to scripture, but maybe aren't necessarily like seeing miracles. You know, this isn't like the time of Moses, where not only are there miracles happening, but there are sorcerers and demons and like other wild things happening that like demonstrate something to back up your faith all the time. This is like, well, theoretically, we know those things are possible, maybe, or we've been told they're possible. So the Church of the Sovereign was similar to the Catholic Church in that there's a lot of rules and sort of regulations about how you're supposed to live your life. And it's sort of backed up with like a moralistic reward system and whatnot. And also some of those rules are conflicting. And it is difficult to live in the way that religion tells you to live. Because of that, like after the fall, after like an apocalypse happens, you'd probably be looking to your local pastor or your local priest going, what the hell? I've been trying to live my life pretty good, and now seasons don't flow in the right order. What is going on? And so there was like some floundering of that large church that used to be connected and couldn't be connected to itself anymore, because part of that church's structure depended on colonization, depended on people going around the world to evangelize their gospel and, you know, set up churches and whatnot and offshoots around the world. Those structures started to fall apart. And a little bit later, a prophet, somebody came forward and settled on, God is dead. And that's why the world is bad, is we don't have God anymore. And why don't we have God anymore? Because of you people. Because you were sinful, because you didn't do things correctly. Now the world has gone bad. And that is a direct result of our sin as the creations of the sovereign. So the, you know, central message of the Catholic Church is, you know, that Christ died to excuse your sins. Christ died to, you know, offer you forgiveness and absolution and grace. And the Church of the Slain God is that through a dark mirror, which is God died because of your sins, and you bear responsibility for that. So that is like the fun that I decided to have with it, because you know, they're very close messages, but also very different messages. And like the Church of the Sovereign and the Church of the Slain God are clearly harsher. You know, like one thing that I will say to anybody who, you know, feels a little bit squicked out about the idea of God being dead in a setting, or the idea of, you know, this dark mirror church existing, is that fundamentally, this is not the God of the Catholic Church. The sovereign was never a loving and peaceful God. The sovereign, like, sucked. And like a lot of the institutional and, like, you know, scriptural ecumenical like conflicts built into that religion can be placed, the blame can be placed on the sovereign himself. Wow. And, you know, not necessarily the people worshiping the sovereign, even though they didn't help. So like, and maybe this is a little bit of a spoiler in that hey, God is dead, but it's really not that bad that he's dead, and it's probably a good thing.
I thought of like Nietzsche and the idea of like God is dead, but from like I thought it's such a fascinating mental exercise to imagine a world where it's like, yes, God is dead, and it's all your fault. It's your fault that God is dead. Which I think is fascinating.
And we're told half that anyway. Like, we're told that, Jesus died and suffered because he was doing this for you. There's just a difference of like, one is an act of kindness and the other is like a full-on guilt trip, and like, hey, you basically drove the poison dagger into his heart, you sinful monster.
Well, I mean, it almost makes sense to me that that concept of this world building would come from someone with a Catholic background. Like, because to be honest, like I do think that a lot of what people I know, so I guess to pull back the curtain a little bit, I don't have a Roman Catholic background. I have a fundamentalist evangelical background, though, and there's a lot of similarities between when I talk to, but my parishioners now, a lot of them grew up Roman Catholic. I'm in a very Catholic, Irish Catholic area where I live outside of Philadelphia. And so when I talk to people with that Irish Catholic and that Italian Catholic background, I hear a lot of commonalities like with people who grew up in the fundamentalist evangelical world with me, like a lot of commonalities there around the kind of like way you internalize a kind of atonement. Like what you're describing is a way of talking about the death of Jesus and its atoning nature. Mm-hmm. And there is a way in which I think, especially in Catholicism, people, and again, this is just, I'm not saying this is universal. I'm not trying to make a universal statement for folks out there, but I am trying to say in my experience of people who talk about their Catholic background, I hear a lot of internalizing of the guilt and shame and blame. Like, Jesus died for your sin, so therefore when you sin, it's like you're driving the nails in his hands. And so like, I'm kind of not surprised that this idea of the Church of the Slain God naturally emerges from the psyche of like growing up with a Roman Catholic American background.
Absolutely. Like that is, I mean, Catholic guilt is like a notorious cultural thing, and a lot of what we look at when we look at like malfeasance, when we look at sin, there is a bizarre sort of transactional relationship surrounding sin, in that, it's bad things that you do, and whether you do them intentionally or not, you are responsible for them, and you can do things to make up for them. The things that you do hurt something that loves you, something that really cares about you, and you living your best life, and you can apologize and make up for it, but like, you're probably going to keep sinning and doing terrible things. So it's this bizarre cycle of guilt. And, in the Church of the Slain God, there is a dark mirror to that, in that because the world has become absolutely chaotic and people are suffering and looking for solutions, the solution that the Church of the Slain God is proposing is, hey, let's atone for those sins. There's not a real path for how to atone, though, because God is dead. So, like, what do you do? It's where you're swimming and living in guilt, and you see so many terrible things, and you've internalized the idea that in some small way, those terrible things are your fault, or are the fault of your ancestors, and whatnot. And a good person, a righteous person, would figure out a way to atone for that. Maybe that will restore the world, and maybe it won't. The only thing that like you can be sure of is every sinful act that you commit, related is related to that suffering and will perpetuate that suffering.
It's amazing. I'm just thinking of the ramifications. I'm just thinking about living in a world in which the world, like you described. Well, okay, hold on. Here's a thought I had earlier. I'll tie it back to, because I think that people can maybe relate to this. One of the things maybe this is completely unintentional in your world building, but like I was thinking about one of the big tragedies of one of the most horrific tragedies of like the 20th and 21st century in Roman Catholicism that I think has led to a lot of people to feel like the seasons don't work anymore. Like that kind of thing you were describing about how the world doesn't work anymore is the betrayal of the Catholic Church with the scandal around child abuse. And so here is the church that so many people put their faith in and love in and put meaning into and identity and all this stuff. And the betrayal of that, the betrayal that people experience, it is that kind of reality shattering event.
Yeah. That
you come to the other side of and nothing is the same anymore. And so when you're talking about the idea of like, well, how do people relate to the church now with this people are saying, hey, what the hell? I've been following this religion and now the seasons literally aren't working anymore. When you said that, I thought of that just shocking revelation of the truly tragic betrayal of the institution of the child abuse scandal and the continual reveal of details about that. And I wonder, and I just thought of, that's just where my mind connected. And I wondered if there wasn't some level of, I don't know that was intentionally in your design, but certainly I think there is a commonality with experience that people can have of their church failing them in that great way.
Yeah. So for me, that's actually something that I look at more when I talk about like the governmental side of this. I mean, all churches are composed at the end of the day of people. And, we know that people are flawed. If you're a Catholic, you know that people are born sinful. Like there is an original sin attached to you upon your birth, and you're also probably going to sin more as you grow up and live your life and whatnot. Which means that even if it is representing something that is supposed to be holy, sacred, and perfect, there is a lot of flaw in the institutional arm of these beliefs. So the Church of the Slain God, I have structured to kind of be as Catholic as possible, but coded after some of the most chaotic periods in the history of Catholicism. Specifically, like the structure of leadership for the Church of the Slain God is modeled specifically after the brief period in the history of Catholicism where there were 3 popes. Everybody was kind of arguing over who should be the pope, and several factions of different bishops declared that their person was the pope. It was a huge thing. So in the world of the Church of the Slain God, there are 3 voxes who have, like papal authority almost, but they are all 3 recognized and legitimate voxes that recognize each other's authority, but constantly battle over things. And I say this to point out, like, what they're doing as cultural leaders, as religious leaders, is really messy and ineffective, because what they're concerned about isn't really like their religious mission, their preaching. Like the people leading the Church of the Slain God aren't really doing their best to restore the world by like aiding people not to sin anymore, or mechanically, however you would put that idea together. They're concerned about the power that is held by the church and how that power is dictated, and they don't want to give too much power to any of the other voxes because that might reduce their power. And they need to keep the tithes coming, so they have to run their institutions a particular way. And that is a thing in our real world, in that religions can fail you because people can fail you, and people lead your religions. And there's this horrible scandal, like the acts of some terribly flawed human beings, left, people's lives like disrupted in like a truly awful way. And what did the people around them who were in power, who knew about these actions do? They covered them up. They covered them up because they were concerned about the larger damage to their institution, which, it is hard to look at that favorably or even charitably in any way. So, like that scandal is like shocking and terrible and like definitely rattled, a lot of people in my life's like relationship with their faith, certainly. And I think what I've tried to do to reflect like those ideas is really build in human frailty to the system of a religion that like, hey, this is a religion that gives you a lot of reasons to be faithful because suddenly the seasons started flowing out of order. There's a pretty demonstrable like change in the world that they can point to and associate with like the story of their religion and their mission. Also, they have friggin' magic powers. They can like literally there is the equivalent of like your bishop could come to your town and like heal an illness. Right. So they they have a lot of oomph to back up some of their claims. But, despite having the power to heal people, despite having, tithes from communities, from metropolitan communities where people are very rich and, congregations out where people are very poor, they're not really redistributing this wealth. Like a lot of what they're doing are flawed things that humans do and that governments do. Yeah.
Hey, can I ask you a question? Where does that, if their God is dead, where does the power to heal people come from?
So, I mean, that is the thing about voxes. Like actually the thing, if you are not a Catholic and you are not familiar with Catholic dogma, the thing that you have to know about the Pope is that the Pope, according to Catholicism, can literally talk to God. Like, that is why the things that the Pope says are important, because the Pope can pray to God and God can answer those prayers. And, you might, when you as a person pray to God, think that God hears you and answers your prayers, but like through the structure of the church, through the structure of what the church recognizes as true, you, if you are a Catholic, have to know and accept that when the God answers the Pope's prayers, it's a real conversation. So for the Voxes commune with the empty throne. There are still servants of the slain God in heaven. And, through their connection to the remaining servants in the empty heaven, they are like operating through the dictates, doing what needs to be done to like please the throne and perhaps restore the world, though they're not making any promises.
That's fascinating. The idea of communing with the empty throne is very interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, well, when you get to like just do make-em-ups, you can do all sorts of weird stuff.
Yeah, I was just thinking about how all that stuff about the brokenness of human beings and the ability of human beings to just do despicable things, or not even despicable things, but also just hurtful and wrong things that maybe aren't on the scale of some of the stuff we're talking about, but on even just a smaller scale. Like, the idea that I, as a parish priest, am not going to hurt a parishioner. Like, of course I am at some point. I have hurt parishioners. And when I did that, I represented more than just Ben. I was also the church. And maybe also for them, I was God, which is the weight that somebody who wears the kind of collar I wear, or whatever, or even if you don't, but, carries the office, the weight we can carry. We have to remember that. I think the responsibility that for people, even though like, I don't want people to think of like when I hurt them to have it be God for them, but I can't help that. You know what I mean? I can't help the meaning making. But anyway, I was just thinking about how the shame of all of that, though, is that for me, like that's what I think is so amazing about we don't have to go down this rabbit hole very much, but is just amazing about the actual gospel story. So like the actual trial and crucifixion story of Jesus is like, it is the kind of story that shows what happens when people in power try to hold on to that power. It is the kind of story that shows what happens when, again, a colonizing force, right, holds on to power in a place where they, where those people don't want them. And when some of the people there also are willing to give in to that colonizing force a little bit in order to protect their power. And so like, it's exactly that kind of story.
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the most frustrating things about the role that the Catholic Church has played in the world stage and in the world's history is that Jesus, in most of the Gospels, is very transparently a radical socialist. So the fact that we have come together as surrounding that story, the institution that we built surrounding that story, is a weird colonial capitalist overlord that like committed many of the sins that like compelled at least the historical figure of Jesus to act in the first place. Oh boy, is it a bummer, to put it very lightly.
Boy, is it a bummer is definitely one one response to it. I just keeping an eye on the chat. The
Kickstarter has ended.
Oh, good,
wonderful.
I was gonna keep that. See that? Oh yeah, we're way past when it was supposed to end. I did not do a good job keeping track on the time. That's awesome. So so the goal was like way less, right? I have it up here.
I think the goal was like 8,000. I can't remember which, but we definitely funded over, which is absolutely wonderful.
Congratulations.
I'm so very excited.
Yeah, there it is. Successfully backed 21,184. So awesome. That's awesome. Congratulations. And congrats to the cast and everything of that show.
Yeah. I think the congratulations really belong to Allie, Drew, Aaron, and Palomi, like the team behind Courier's Call. They poured so much work and enthusiasm into that story, and it's been great so far, and I'm so excited for where it's going next.
Yeah. Well, my daughter's going to be excited. She's going to end up with a birthday message at some point in the future, so that's exciting. I did want to, and maybe you already answered this, but one of the questions I wanted to ask you before we spent the last hour talking about it was there a spirituality to your childhood? So beyond the institution, of, say, growing up Catholic, was there sort of a spirituality present in your childhood?
Define what you mean by spirituality.
I don't want to, because I really so I can't.
Okay, I mean, if it's intentionally vague, maybe we'll take it that way. I would say so. My family, like, we were I attended church every week, with exceptions for sickness or vacations where it was impossible or things like that, until I was like 15. One of the things that caused a separation is I think Ratzinger becoming Pope, because that had signaled to my family that like, oh, things aren't really going to get much more progressive over there. Like, it would be really interesting if our current Pope had become the Pope around the time I was 15. But regardless, like, it really, like, bitterly kind of just after my confirmation, like this had happened. Anyway, I would say that I believed what I was told, that there was a force called God who was good and loved literally everybody on the planet, and that figure had sent down their son, and that person suffered and died, and through that had made some positive changes to the world. So like, when I prayed, especially when I was younger, like, I believed those things that I was praying about, and I believed them within the structure of that story, even if there were many times where I, paused and questioned specific aspects of it.
I'm wondering if you if that has influenced the way you think about you just when you talk about it almost I just think of like I think of story. You said story. I mean, I think of story, and I think of story making and story writing, and world. I'm just wondering if any of those experiences you think influenced sort of the world builder and the game player that you became.
Probably it's inseparable, right? Like,
Right.
So I spent such a large portion of my life learning about and believing in this thing. I can't help but be a product of it. And that brings us back to some of the more positive and celebratory aspects of culture.
Yeah.
Regardless of the things that the Catholic Church has done, and the history behind, like how at least the Irish portion of my family adopted Catholicism and took Catholicism with them as their religion when they were forced out of their home country to the United States. Like, it is also one of the things that my family has shared, one of the things that defined their experience and how they defined themselves, and one of the ways in which they were kind to each other. There is, like, as much as there is guilt, like in Catholic dogma and Catholicism as a culture, there is also solace. It is a thing that you can use not just to control someone's behavior, but comfort them, especially in times of crisis, to inspire wonder, to give them the feeling that they are loved, and that despite the suffering in the world, there will be goodness, peace, and joy at some point. So, like, that is, no matter what, like that is kind of beautiful. And when people are invested in their approach to Catholicism and whatnot, like, that is a thing that you gotta respect. Like, you can be flippant and say, like, oh, being Catholic, like, that is supporting this horrible colonial force, but at the end of the day, it's when my ancestors immigrated to the United States, is what they took with them, is what they taught their kids.
Yeah.
And that experience isn't invalid, even if it's complicated.
Yeah. Yeah. Someone in the chat, I apologize for the little, my calendar was dinging at me. People might have heard that. I apologize. One of the things someone said in the chat was asking what you did, which is like, well, what does that mean by spirituality? What do you mean by spirituality? And I think, like, I like to ask that question about spirituality of your childhood intentionally in a vague way, because I think that different people answer it with they bring themselves to the question, and they answer it whatever, in a way that it means for them. And that's purposely why I ask it. But I think that it can really be anything that, it doesn't even have to be religious activity, but I just think, like, religious activity can do this. And certainly the ties to family and culture that you're talking about do this, but anything that kind of gives you, activities that sort of give you a sense of awe or wonder, or the sense that you are small and creation is far bigger than you are, that maybe help you locate yourself into, and so to me, when I think of spirituality, that's sort of where my mind goes. But I mean, it is, again, I do ask it in a purposely vague way, because I do wonder what people will bring to the question, and what they, what may be spiritual for them.
Yeah. I mean, I think in that definition, it's revealing a lot about how you view spirituality. Exactly. Because, like, exactly. I would not associate the feeling of spirituality of being something that necessarily makes you smaller. Like, I think especially, like, Christianity as a whole, and this certainly is reflected in Skyjacks. Christianity as a whole, because of the historical context of how it evolved, and especially surrounding the Catholic Church, has put a large focus on justifying kings, on justifying royalty in and of itself. And therefore, I think a symptom of the perspective that religion gives you is that you are a small thing and there are big things. I might almost define spirituality as like how you relate to the world and how you relate to belief, and how you find like a sense of place and perhaps a sense of purpose.
Yeah,
I think it's a really messy and complicated question.
Sure.
One that humans have tried to answer for a very long time because we've seen them come up with so many fascinating religions, systems of belief, and mythologies.
Yeah, absolutely. So, James, can I ask you a question? Would you be willing to take 2 to 3 minutes to pause, take a quick break, allow people to put questions in the chat, then come back and take questions? Can we do that?
Oh, sure.
Is that cool? And maybe I'll think of more that I have, but I don't want to be totally selfish. I want to let people ask questions. So that's what I'm going to throw up our Be Right Back screen real quick. We're just going to take 2 or 3 minutes. So please, folks, stick around. Feel free to hit the follow button, by the way, on the Twitch if you want to. And James and I will be right back, and we'll answer more questions. Go ahead and throw them in the chat. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can. So we'll be right back. All right. So James and I are back. Thanks, folks, for sticking around. We're going to answer your questions. If you have questions, please do throw them in the chat. We'll get to them. And I mean, I guess I can't promise James will answer literally anything. But I mean, I'll
answer most things. I think, unless you, listener, somehow. I mean, actually, I don't want to say this because never mind.
Okay, fine. But
I don't want people to like guess their like canon theories or whatever. And if somebody accidentally stumbles on the truth and I don't answer the question, then they're like, aha, I've got it.
Right.
Yeah.
But if folks have questions, even it's just about life and we a lot of times on Holy Happy Hour Batman, a lot of the folks who are watching right now have never seen the show before. We end up just talking about, who this person is in their life and depending on the show. So feel free to ask questions in the chat and we'll try to get to them. But we did have a great question that we wanted to get at, which had to do with the luminaries and whether or not the sovereign is do you have the question? Oh, there it is. I see it. So
yeah.
No, actually, this is a different question. So
oh no, it's okay. I have it is the sovereign a god in the way that is somehow distinct from other luminaries or just another luminary?
Yeah.
So this is a complicated question because it touches on the nature of luminaries in the setting itself. Luminaries are a name shared between many important underlying forces that exist in the world that, like, you could call them spiritual forces, and I don't think that would be inaccurate. Some of them are beings. Some of them, like the Sovereign. The Sovereign was a luminary that was a thinking and independent being. The Forest Queen is also, similar. The Forest Queen has a body. In a sense, that the Forest Queen has a mind and ambitions and goals and whatnot. Some of them are literally stories that repeat themselves throughout time. Things like the Changeling or the Whale. The Whale is a great example because the Whale is just a tale of revenge. And, it traps people in it to a certain degree and lives in stories of revenge that play out across Speir. Some of them are more vague than even that. They're themes that kind of insist themselves upon the world. Things like the Butcher. The Butcher isn't a being, and it's not a specific story, but it is a kind of violence that can take hold of you and pushes people towards violence across Speir. So, these things don't look exactly like each other, but an important thing about the world of Speir is that the game Illimat and the luminaries that are attached to it are everywhere. It is a commonality that exists across Speir, and it is not constant in that a luminary in one place might look or be treated very differently than the same luminary in another place. Not all places agree on the same cast of luminaries and whatnot. But, if you were on a skyship and you landed in a new place that you had never been before and nobody on your ship spoke the language, you could probably take out a deck of luminaries and communicate with the people that you were there with, because they will recognize some of those images. They will recognize some of those themes because it's a commonality that people share. Luminaries have, in what I do for the divinations and luminary polls that we do on the show, they have certain themes and ideas that they represent. And in many ways, if you can say that a luminary is a thing, it is an entity or force that represents that collection of themes. So when we look at the Sovereign and we compare him to other luminaries and we try to decide, is the Sovereign a special case? Is the Sovereign capital G God in the way that the Catholic Church in our world would understand capital G God? the answer to that question is, let me actually pull up the Sovereign's Luminary, because that is one that I don't have memorized, because it's technically not an active luminary that we draw all the time. And I just have to scroll down here, the literal last luminary. Okay. The Sovereign's themes are domination, nobility, and law. So the Sovereign is the entity attached to those ideas. And the story that is told is that the Sovereign created humanity. And I am pretty sure, but not 100%, that is true in some capacity. And that the Sovereign is the entity that represented those ideas. And one of the things that makes those ideas work is that in order to dominate somebody or something, you have to have a thing to dominate. In order for there to be nobility, you need that nobility to be held above other people or of other things. In order to have laws, you have to have beings that abide those laws. So that is the complicated mess that the Sovereign kind of represented. So is the Sovereign a more legitimate god figure than the Forest Queen? I don't think so. Because the Forest Queen, rules the forests in a way that is utterly unconcerned with the dominion of the Sovereign, right? She would not bend a knee to the Sovereign by any stretch of the imagination. It's just that the Sovereign was attached to those ideas, and those ideas they revolve around upholding themselves, about creating that structure of I am a thing above and you are a thing below. So the Sovereign looks more like the god that Christianity teaches you is God. And for that reason, I could say, yeah, you could say that they're more of a god than the other luminaries, because the Sovereign is one of the only luminaries that kind of cares about being looked at as a god. Being worshipped is a thing that the Sovereign was concerned with. But luminaries are complicated. They are like and very unlike each other. And even though they're all in the same group, it's really hard to paint them all with the same brush.
We've got many more questions, so I'm going to keep going through them one by one, if that's cool.
Sure.
So the next one here that I see is someone saying, Lenny Jammin, thank you for being here and watching the show. The person said, I was really deeply impacted by the church service scene in the cave in Nordia. How did your own experiences with church services inform that scene?
So this is a interesting one. What we were trying to do specifically in Nordia, and based on certain fan reactions, I am not sure how successfully we did it, is I wanted Adrian, the person leading the congregation in Nordia, to represent a microcosm of the Church of the Slain God, represent someone who is part of the church, who fundamentally believes in the lessons of the church and cares about her congregation, and is doing her best to do the best by the Book of Sovereignty, the thing that establishes the laws and creeds of the religion, and the community of her congregation. And I wanted that to be a juxtaposition against the lacrima that comes in, that almost kind of bishop-like figure who sails in, who was clearly more deeply invested in the power and institutional forces behind the Church of the Slain God, because there is this duality in organized faith, in that there are some people out there who are really trying to do their best, maybe with a flawed product, and those people are not bad, even if they are beholden to or connected to in some way bad forces. And, you know, I have a really complicated relationship with faith and religion and all of that. But when I see friends who get something out of faith, when I see friends who, you know, are practicing in a particular religion or practice and place importance on spirituality in their own lives, one of the things that I see out of that is a real sense of community. And I think that is one of the most beautiful things that faith can do. And I'll separate that from just religion. Like, not enforce, I feel like that word is too harsh, but foster a sense of community, a sense of connection to other people, and, you know, ideally one that is unselfish and full of grace and whatnot. So, you know, I have friends who do have a deeper spiritual connection, or less complicated, maybe not less complicated, that's probably not correct, but like they have a greater importance in their lives on their spirituality. And the recurring theme that I get from those friends all the time is that the community is one of the most rewarding aspects of it. Yeah. So that scene, I really wanted to emphasize that, you know, that's who Adrian is. That's what Adrian is doing here. There is a little bit of a knife twist in there because, you know, they're drinking seawater, which, you know, all my fans know that's dangerous, that's not good. But like, the reason that they're doing it, the reason that she's having people do it, and, you know, the reason that she has a crisis of faith, like, after meeting Jonnet and seeing how Jonnet opposes the Mariner, is she fundamentally believes the good things and valuable things out of the Book of Sovereignty. And she is trying to embody that for her congregation. Even if her superiors within the church are flawed and bad people, she is trying to do her best to serve that community. So I wanted that scene to showcase that about her, and the fact that even if the Church of the Slain God is like kind of an obviously scene-chewing villainous force in the world of Speir, that there are also people who are getting something out of it, even if they are still being abused by it in some way. So yeah, like it reflects like deep and meaningful things that I have seen with friends. As an ADHD person, it is harder for me to draw a connection between ceremonies that I have been a part of in my time, because they need you to sit still and rigidly pay attention. And I have always struggled with that.
Yeah. That's interesting. And a conversation for a different conversation for a different time about the idea of neurodivergent liturgy. But we do have more questions. So another question about Speir, and you may have touched on some of this with the when you were talking about the luminaries, but about religion before and after the sovereign died, and whether there were many religions before and after, have new faiths emerged since the sovereign died. Is a question. Thank you to Winged Scribe for the question and for being here.
Yes. The answer to both of those questions is yes, absolutely. Like, one of the things, if you're being anti-colonial, you know, you need to support the fact that there are different cultures and belief systems around the world. One of the reasons that I hesitate to say that the sovereign created humanity is that, like, that makes one religion feel truer than others, which is, it's hard to reconcile that with being anti-colonial. So, you know, yes, there are other religions across Speir. There are other belief systems across Speir. The reason that we are encountering the Church of the Slain God is kind of that church's relationship with colonialism through its history. because they are worshiping a figure like the sovereign that is upholding things like nobility, like domination, that sort of thing, there is an evangelical path to this religion. Way back before the stars fell, one of the things that the Church of the Slain God prioritized was putting their preachers, their agents, on ships that were going around Speir, specifically to establish and spread that religion across the world. When the stars fell, those, like, a lot of religions everywhere suffered because they were all facing the similar challenge that the Church of the Slain God was, which is, hey, we've been practicing like this cultural belief. Why is the world bad now? What do we do about that? The Church of the Slain God like had this evangelism as part of its history. So it was scattered across Speir, which helped it survive, just because there were people who were connected to this religion. And also because like they're evangelizing on land too, there are patches of mainland that where they're kind of still connected together. They kept that sort of underlying theme to the religion after the fall. And when, you know, this prophet figure stepped forward with like the roadmap for how the Church of the Slain God would operate in this new version of Speir, they were primed to like, well, you know, we got to spread it around. And when sky shipping showed up, the church was an early investor in that, and, you know, has a you know, fleet of sky ships because they were focused on making sure that even after the fall, they are spreading their word somehow. That's why they are a central force. Every like community across Speir like has their own belief system and their own culture. Some of that can be, in a sense, spiritual. Like if we look at the Black Lilies, another organization that spread itself across Speir, Ali Brinken, the writer who like came up with the Black Lilies, pointed out that, you know, this evolved kind of out of a cult. And eventually, because these different chapters of Black Lilies, you know, were spread out and the fall happened, you know, what emerged is it doesn't quite feel the same everywhere, but there is a important underlying current of beliefs that kind of define their identity and their experience and how they interact with the world. So like you could call the Black Lilies a form of faith, even though it is the real answer is more complicated than that. But yeah, there are definitely other religions. We just hear about the Church of the Slain God because it has worked very hard to get itself to be heard about.
I'm going to keep going because we got so many. This is also, thank you for this. This is so much fun. I'm enjoying this so much. I was just thinking about how cool it is that you get to answer questions about this world you're making, like professionally, and just how joyful that is, right? And how cool it is. But anyway, so another question about, this one's really interesting to me. What might academic theology, so I don't know if this is TWIGTH. Sorry, I'm not sure how you pronounce that screen name, but thank you for being here. What might academic theology or cosmology look like in the world of Speir with practices like star watching and other magics? I imagine it could be quite vibrant. So
I am so glad you asked this, because one of the priorities that I had, because I was doing the Catholic Church, I wanted a very complicated system of how things are declared canon and what things are held true. So in the Church of the Slain God, there are 3 levels of canon, 3 levels to understand how true certain aspects and certain practices are held. Because you have 3 voxes, each vox has to like put their approval and canonize a particular thing. So there is Massimo canon, which is something that is held true by all 3 voxes, that each vox recognizes within their particular tradition of the Church of Slain God, and is like, if you're part of the church, this is a core belief. Then there is Maggiore canon, which is just 2 of the voxes have declared that this is canon, meaning it is not a universal constant across the religion. And the voxes that have approved it have probably done so through a long and difficult diplomatic trial. And finally, there is minore canon, which is just 1 vox upholds this as true. Why I included this is part of how the Bible itself is structured, and this extends past like Christianity back into the Old Testament or the Torah. If you look at Genesis, the story of Genesis happens twice with like very few variations on how it like changes. If you are familiar with like pop culture and the idea of there being a demon named Lilith, one of the explanations that people have come up with for why the story of Genesis plays out twice is Adam literally had 2 wives. That one is named Eve and the other is unnamed. That was Lilith, who went off and became a demon. So like it's that is a wild thing, but the reason that is in there very likely is that when they were constructing the Torah initially, there were 2 groups that didn't see eye to eye, and the compromise that they made is both of their texts went into the final product. So the story just repeats itself as kind of a solution for that disagreement over how things should be worded. That sort of messy diplomacy dictating the literal beliefs of a massive religion is so fascinating to me. And it also gets at that nerdy stuff that I was talking about earlier, that like the people who are making these rules are people who care about, like, you know how some people really care about Star Wars? Like, you think of my very good friend Pranks Paul, who knows so much and like loves looking through the source books and whatnot that Lucas Publishing puts out. Like, those are the people who are rising to prominent positions of power in the church. And like the discussions that we have over like which superheroes would win in a fight and whatnot, like that becomes a part of ecumenical politics. That's which I find so cool. Yeah, it's wild. So I wanted a structure that lent itself to being absolutely messy and chaotic and depend on a lot of as much political maneuvering as deciding what face are we really presenting to our congregation? What do we want to prioritize as a religion? What do we want people to believe? All of those questions are considered by the Church of the Slain God in the choices that they make. But yeah, like, so there is a complicated canonization system, and because of that, like certain aspects of scripture and whatnot are held in high esteem in canon. There are saint figures as well attached to the Church of the Slain God that we really haven't been able to explore very much. But you'll notice that one of the other things that I took from this is more Catholic folk belief, but reliquy. Reliquy, for those who don't know, in Speir, it is using the dead parts of a person as part of practicing magic. Right. In the real world and the real Catholic Church, reliquy was a common practice where they used the literal body parts of saints, like they held them as sacred and holy, and said that they had special like divine power. And many churches, like especially like if you go to some of the older churches in Italy that were constructed around the Renaissance and whatnot, they just have relics in there on display. They're like body parts that are supposed to be the parts of saints attached to the totally radical and like wild stories of those people's lives and especially how they died. So like that is all folded in there. So, to answer that question, like, yeah, that sort of scholarship, it's deeply important and deeply contentious and like almost vicious in many ways, but it also allows us to have lots of interesting microcosm folk belief in the Church of the Slain God. And some of it is approved by voxes, and some of it isn't.
Yeah.
And it's all very messy and like.
It's the only way you could do the Catholic Church, like Roman Catholic faith, in a fantasy sort of setting, or like a setting like this. I think would have to be that messy, because so much of what goes into being Roman Catholic is the sort of folk and cultural and sort of stuff that has grown around it. Some of the stuff that is even rejected by the institution of the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think religion in fantasy suffers from a lot when I encounter it is that because we get to create it whole cloth from nothing, and there is kind of an organized view of how it's created and whatnot, is it's not really messy or complicated. For sure in fantasy settings, like you can, like in D&D, you can literally talk to your deity. Like, right. There's a spell to do that. So that makes the question of faith a lot more complicated. Like, what does faith mean when you can, speed dial your god and find out what's going on? But like, because it is created intentionally and in an organized way, and there aren't a lot of disagreements unless you go out of your way to build them into it, is very clean. Which means it's hard to represent truly a force like the Catholic Church, because Catholic Church isn't clean. It's messy, and, participated in a lot of terrible things in history. And partially that's because a lot of terrible people took steps to take power and do bad stuff with that power. Like, I referenced the Medicis earlier. Like, they held the papal seat for a bit, and they were just a awful noble family that did so many cruel and terrible things to accumulate wealth and power. And for them, the seat of the Pope was just another method for doing that. Yeah. So, like, yeah, it's all messy. That scholarship is deeply important, and like, there are probably plenty of adventurous stories that could be told surrounding that.
I hope folks really take a mental note of that. I think you hit on something really accurate to what a lot of times in our RPG settings, like the way they do religion in a way that just isn't realistic to reality, is that the complicated and messy nature around it. I hope folks put a little mental pin in that. That was, I think, really insightful. But sort of related to what we were just talking about, one of the questions here is, are there any other communities we could see in the future? So Captain Saf, thank you for watching and giving us this question. They referenced in Nordia, the priest of the slain god, Adrian and her followers, who had a very distinct, different practice compared to what we heard about the church thus far. Could we see in the future communities that have very practices or different views of the slain god?
So yes, one thing to note is they're already there. Because we have 3 voxes, right. There are already, there are definitely congregations that identify more strongly with one vox than another. And, those voxes have minore canon and even maggiore canon, which means they have beliefs and practices that are more common in congregations belonging to their bishops and their lacrima than others. So there's already that variation. This question, and I think another one by the Crafty DM later on, are specifically kind of referencing what happened with Adrian and in Nordia. And I think the Crafty DM asks, are there any plans for Adrian to become a Martin Luther type figure? So the parallels between Adrian and Martin Luther, are hard to ignore. If you look up the history of Martin Luther, he was just some dude who, really believed and really had the faith, and then saw a lot of people with institutional power within the Catholic Church not really living in a way that
Oh, James, I think we lost your audio. All right, hold on, folks. Hopefully we'll fix this relatively quickly.
Yep.
Oh, we're back. Cool.
Yeah. So yeah, like Luther airing those grievances caused like a massive sect to break off, and all sorts of wars and colonial conflicts and whatnot. But like the parallels to Adrian are unignorable. To answer part of the question, originally it wasn't part of the plan, but we drew those luminaries after we resolved that part of her story with Jonnet and sort of what she would go on to do. I can't. It's hard for me to justify that not happening. I don't know how important that will be to the story that we're telling. We're still kind of very early on in the story of Skyjacks. So, as it maybe becomes necessary or convenient when things come up, perhaps that will show up in the show. No matter what, I believe that Adrian is treating her congregation very differently and questioning a lot of the things that she did not question in the past. She is still applying that same intentional commitment to her community and prioritizing the people who are in her parish. But she is not beholden spiritually to the things the Church of the Slain God has insisted on, because like she has had a transformative experience in meeting Jonnet and seeing the things that Jonnet does, and in seeing the ways in which authorities from the Church of the Slain God have failed her. So that I hope answers that question.
Yeah, I think it does. But I'm going to keep going with other questions. There's one here that seems a little bit complex, but from Lost River 2014, thank you for watching. And this question, which is one of their favorite things about Skyjacks, is the way the story incorporates post-Lapsarian /fall/post-apocalyptic mythology, both in world building and its characters and their arcs. Could you talk a little bit about the process of integrating that theme /arc into your story?
Yeah, I mean, so what I wanted was a transformative event that changed the world, and specifically the reasons that we had the stars fall and do the things that they did is the world of Speir before the fall looked very similar to around the Renaissance period of our world, around like the European expansion and, subsequent colonization of the rest of the world. I wanted to cut off that system at the legs before it really got to do much damage. I did want European, quote unquote, European colonizers to start moving around the world, giving the world an awareness of itself that, hey, there are other places than here and we could potentially trade with them. But before, they sent like soldiers over to kill people or introduce diseases that cause plagues or anything like that. Because I wanted a sense of the world having a memory of colonialism, having a memory that there is the rest of the world out there, but not having done anything that feels so like one of the things about colonialism when you engage with it is it feels so defeating because so much awfulness has already taken place. Like unforgivable things have already been done, and those actions are things that people, especially in privileged and colonial empires, are benefiting from actively today. So like that thinking of being anti-colonialist and all that can feel very defeating. Taking, again, referencing my Irish ancestry. I am here on U.S. soil, which was stolen from indigenous people. The reason that I am here is because my ancestors back in Ireland were literally through oppressive forces driven out by the English, and they had nowhere else to go. All of that is so much, and it feels so hard to overcome. So in Speir, that expansion starts and then stops because the world ended. And not only that, the world ended and became strange and difficult. And most of these colonial powers had built their power structures around the idea that we're going to be taking in a lot of wealth from places that are not here. In order to serve a city like London, you need to be shipping in resources from all sorts of other places. So those places started to crumble and collapse as it was hard to farm in a way that could sustain an empire. It was hard to ship in a way that could sustain an empire. It was hard to be connected into your various fiefdoms and whatnot in a way that helps you sustain an empire, because so many of the changes that happened after the fall made it impossible or very difficult to live life in an imperial fashion. There's some thematic connection to the death of the sovereign there, but all of that is kind of built around making the essential story of Skyjacks possible, in where anti-colonial, in that colonialism hopefully will be defeated in the course of our story, or at least the last vestiges and most awful faces of it will, and there will be an opportunity to imagine what it is like to build a world outside of those oppressive structures. So like all that after the fall stuff was really to create that separation, but it also, has a lot of other fringe benefits in that I don't have to have a really complicated history because people don't remember parts of it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff in that. But yeah, that is like the main point. I hope that touched on the question well enough.
Yeah, I think it definitely did. So there's a lot of questions in the chat, and I don't know that we're going to end up getting to all of them or not, because there's a lot of rich questions. And if there's any that you want to answer, I'm curious if you want to answer the personal one, because there was one that was personal, and I would love to ask it of you. If there's any that you want to make sure you answer, feel free to grab one out of there. But the question from Lenny Jammin, thank you for being here and asking the question, was a personal one, so different than some of the other ones that we've been doing. Which they say, I know a lot of people who, after leaving Christianity, end up migrating temporarily or permanently to other faiths. Have you had any similar experiences to that in your own story?
I have not. It's a complicated thing to say. Like, I really don't approve of the Catholic Church and what it has done and what it continues to do. I will say the new pope that we've got is better than any pope that I've seen or read about. And the fact that extremely conservative American bishops oppose him, signals that, like, I'm glad that he's there. He still keeps saying some stuff that sucks. Like, that's the thing. Can't really have faith in what is essentially a government that gives me absolutely no agency to enforce what is good or right on the world. As far as faith in and of itself, like, I don't think any other organized religion is going to call out to me, because it's shades of the same problem. In that, even if you're not looking at the Catholic Church, like, other churches are still led by people, and gosh, are there problems. As far as faith in and of itself, that is so hard to say for me. For a very long time, like, there was some element of faith still present in my life, and I can't even commit here to say that it's not there anymore. But, if I were to have the opportunity to speak to God, I would probably have notes. I mean, God essentially designed humanity only playtesting it once, and that playtest went disastrously as far as I'm concerned. It is complicated, but suffice to say that, no, I have not jumped to other faiths or belief structures post-Catholicism.
thank you for being willing to answer a very personal question about it, about faith. Are there any other questions here in the chat you want to make sure that we get to?
Yeah, I'm let's see here. I'm just reading through here.
And thanks to everybody who's putting questions in the chat. I really appreciate your involvement for sure. These are really deep, really great questions.
Okay, so this one comes from Captain Saf. This may be slightly off topic, but the island is a very big part of the Sovereign story. But its initial introduction in the Decemberist canon was a retelling / adaptation of The Tempest. How did you decide that this specific story and its themes would connect so deeply with the Sovereign's mythology? I want to make something very clear. The island and the parts that is referenced with it. The Sovereign was killed on an island. That is not the island. When I say the island in the setting, the island is a collection of bones and wrecked ships that the Mariner was born on. That is the island. So there might be a connection between them. And if there is a connection between them, we will discover that through the story that we tell on the show. But those are different things. How did I decide that the specific story element would connect to the rest of the story? It was mainly because of the very sinister tone of the island. Like if you listen to the collection of songs, The Island, I think The Landlord's Daughter, and I can't remember the third off the top of my head right now. It's very sinister. It's very dark. But because it's sinister and dark, and we had in our world building this force, the Mariner, this evil force that was challenging the land and basically fighting a war with everybody who was on land. I wanted to connect that figure's origin story to the island, to all of the miserable and evil things that take place in those songs, and all of the miserable and evil actions of the Mariner itself. That's the reason that curlews are evil, is because curlews are specifically called out in the story of the island in those Decemberist songs. So really, it's just, here's a vaguely sea-based source of evil. I'm just going to marry those two things together. And I guess the Sovereign enters that equation because I said that it happened on an island, that the Sovereign was slayed on an island, and now that coincidence can't help but become its own.
Yes, grow. Yes.
Okay.
There was a question about angels. I don't know if you saw it, and that was about whether or not we'll see any non-fallen angels and the difference between non-fallen angels, and will we learn differences between. I think the question was something: are there differences between them? Will we see that on the show? That might be a spoiler.
Yes, there are differences between them, and I believe that you will see, non-fallen angels in the show at some point. One of the things that you can see already in Gable's backstory in the history episodes, Liz decided that Gable in their angelic form did not have a body that could be observed. When Travis is a child and Gable is placing judgment upon Travis's parents, Travis doesn't see Gable really. So the relationship of a non-fallen angel to the idea of a physical form is very complicated. And fallen angels don't so much have that complication. I mean, looking at Gable, like Liz mentioned, there's a bit of a magic eye feeling, you can't keep your eyes on them. That is an artifact of that deeper angelic nature, but also a thing that I want, we do know now that fallen cannot die, but in other ways, in pretty much all other ways, they are not different than human beings. that is kind of an important distinction to me, because I don't want to invalidate Gable's experience as a non-binary being. Gable is non-binary because Gable got to come into our system of society and gender as an outsider and decided that it was not for them. Because of that, I don't want to invalidate any process of that. Just because Gable gets to have a cool backstory and superpowers doesn't mean that they are somehow less valid as being a non-binary gender fluid person. So
I did see another question, if you want me to grab it.
Yeah.
Which was, I don't think you answered this one. If you did, forgive me. But Captain Staff also asked, what did Margaret mean when she said the Sovereign wasn't part of her deck? Does it have something to do with the fact that it's currently out of favor?
Yeah, like the Sovereign not being in her deck. Like Luminary decks are a little bit magical. And we talked about this in the bonus content that we did for Courier's Call. In assembling a deck, like you can create a card back for your Luminary deck. And if somebody gives you a Luminary that they have that you don't have, you can shuffle that card into your deck, and like you will suddenly have a card back with, like, your card back will be on that card and it will be a part of your deck. The Sovereign is not in Luminary decks across Speir because the Sovereign was killed. Like, the Sovereign, I mean, this is an easy thing to point to because, like, it's kind of an obvious thematic connection. When I say there are no kings at the end of Skyjacks, I mean it because the being that represented the idea of nobility was literally killed. And in a lot of ways, like, that means there isn't an influence for the Sovereign in Speir. I don't know what or how it happened, but like slowly over time, or maybe very suddenly and radically, whatever is most convenient to me when I'm exploring it in the story later, Sovereigns stopped showing up in people's Luminary decks. Even if you put a Sovereign card in your deck, you might never draw it. So it is like that card getting pulled up. Honestly, it's in my deck because I have cards that represent different ideas. I've got like prototype Luminaries in my personal Luminary deck. You can see the card backs of some of them are different because of that. That just happened to come out, and I thought it was so interesting that it came out in that reading.
I really like the idea that the Sovereign being dead means that, like, nobility-ness itself, like sovereignness, has died, and what that means for the world. That's fascinating to me. I
mean, and that is part of the anti-colonial thing that we're trying to do, is like the literal, like, thematic forces that support the idea of nobility in the world is gone. Like, I think there's a point where Traveler Quan says Jonnet is born special or was born special. That's literally not true, and is part of probably the vestiges of the influence that the Sovereign had on the world, like influencing that's getting weeded out. But like on Speir, partially because the Sovereign is dead, literally no one is born special. It all depends on individual action and whatnot, and that is, like, the things that make you special that you might be born with are all cultural things. They're things given to you by other people, given to you by participating in a community, or things that you would go out and find and discover for yourself and decide to hold and cherish or what have you. But yeah, like the thematic mechanisms that would support those ideas in the world are currently broken.
We've got some more questions. So where was the one? Oh, so someone said if this is a spoiler, don't answer, but they asked if Kuhulain is an angel or not.
I can confirm that Ku is not an angel.
Okay. There we go. I didn't even read this next question out loud yet. I mean, sorry, even in my head yet, but I'm just going to keep going because it just came in. There's 2 new ones, which Old Nintendrone, thank you for being here and asking a question.
Ooh, good name.
Said, yeah. You've hired people to write stories for your worlds with a focus on bringing in some more diverse perspectives, which I love, by the way. Do you also do your own research when developing new areas that reference real life countries, beliefs, folklore, etc., beyond your own base of knowledge? And then if so, what does that research look like for you?
For me, I try to avoid centering myself as a researcher for bringing in cultural perspectives outside of my zone, as it were, because like even people who spend, devote themselves academically to studying cultural history make missteps and misuse that authority and whatnot. I've just seen it break bad in so many ways. My solution is to hire people who, have those cultural experiences, who are connected to those cultures, who are knowledgeable about those cultures, to write about their own experiences. I then take that fiction and I try to support it within my world. That might not be a perfect thing, but it is a system that I feel comfortable enough to stand behind, because what we're not doing is like going, hey, this is fantasy Spain or what have you. What we're saying instead is this is somebody's idea informed by their cultural history, and we are going to incorporate it into this world and support it to make it fit with everything and do interesting and dynamic things. I do in things that are related to my experiences and my heritage and whatnot. Like I do research, and that's mostly researching things like, oh, this is what I find interesting, and this is what I think would be fun and interesting to incorporate. There are probably some things that are slightly outside of my sphere that might get incorporated. More historical things like. Of course, I'm going to forget her name, but the greatest pirate to ever live was a Chinese woman. She was so good at piracy that the Chinese government of her time opted to pay her to stop attacking their ships rather than continue to try and hunt her down and bring her to justice. So she, just as a figure, might show up in the world because that's so cool.
Yeah, it's so
or
cool.
Like someone informed by her. She's right. Just oh gosh, Ching Shi. I probably did not pronounce that properly, but she is such a cool historical figure. Her story is fascinating. We spend all this time talking about boring people like Captain Morgan when we could be talking about people like her. She's so fucking cool. I apologize if I'm not supposed to swear.
Oh, no, you can. You're good. I didn't even think about telling you that in the beginning, but you're good to go. You can say whatever. Yeah, that's really cool. Let's see. I thought I saw another question before the one that just came in, but I'm losing track of them in the chat. Oh, I know, because I was thinking about asking you a question that I had. I'll let you, the viewers get first dibs on these questions, which is this new one came in and says, will we see any communal or communist societies this year?
I mean, yeah, probably. Weirdly, most pirate ships that you see are like that.
Right.
It's communism by way of capitalism, and that's based on real piratical history. If you did not know, all pirate ships were a shared venture, and literally the people who lived on pirate ships had shares in whatever adventures and expeditions that they were going to do. So you had an equal stake in pretty much anything that you were doing as a pirate. That was voted on democratically. So was your captain. You chose your leader through democratic vote. And when you captured a ship and you got its goods, those goods were divided up according to shares. Most of those shares were equal. Sometimes people like the captain or quartermaster or battle master or whatever other roles in the ship would receive a greater share because they had a larger burden of responsibility putting the venture together. But it is a weird semi-communist system that is also interacting with capitalism. And, again, because we want to represent all sorts of different ways of living around Speir, that, there are probably going to be some more communally based societies and cultures that we encounter. Like, I don't necessarily know what Ungoni's structure is, but like I get the sense that they are more community based rather than less. They do have an idea of trade and money, but that's so that they can interact with the outside world, not so that they run that way internally.
One of the things that I wanted to geek out about this entire time is because I'm a big Decemberist fan, which I didn't even get to. We could go very deeply down that rabbit hole, right, of digging into the Decemberist songs and connections and stuff. It's just so cool. So it's just a very surface question related to that, which is, do you have a favorite? I was going to ask if you have a favorite. I'm torn. I'll just ask both. Do you have a favorite Decemberist album? Do you have a favorite Decemberist song?
I mean, Hazards of Love is easily my favorite album.
Okay.
Favorite song is a much more complicated question in that I have so many songs that I have a deep love and affection for, that I listen to over and over and have deep connection to. Like I can just look up my music player right now and see what I put on rotation fairly often. If it will let me get in there. If you can, that would be awesome, because I think people might really be something people might really want to know. Yeah. I mean, my library, or like my tastes aren't necessarily representative of what I like or what I built Speir out of. Mm-hmm. But just songs that I tend to listen to on their own and really love. I like Sons and Daughters. I like, honestly, one of my absolute favorites is Why Would I Now? And a big part of that is its connection to Gable and Travis, because I feel like it very much embodies their relationship. I love a ton of the music on I'll Be Your Girl. That was one of the major albums that influenced Worldbuilding and Speir. I went to see the concert for their tour for I'll Be Your Girl before we made Speir. And I remember part of their design for their stage had a big skull with these like spirals for eyes. And looking at that, hearing like some of the warm-up music before the concert actually started, I was like, ooh, it would be really cool to build a setting or play a campaign where deicide is like the main point of it, where you're like slaying a god of some kind. And it is very funny that like eventually I used that. I like... I like Don't Carry It All. I like Rise to Me, and I like This Is Why We Fight. I am a big fan of the first Decemberist song that I really interacted with were 16 Military Wives and Summer Song. Love those. I love the Bandit Queen. I love the entire album of The Tane. I listen to that very frequently. I am a huge fan of Together, mid-list author, and the singer addresses his audience. Those two together really define my relationship with my career and what I feel like sort of operating in the public eye. And I really like Make You Better. It is a very personal song to me, kind of how I dealt with a difficult like disappointment in life. Hopefully won't remain a disappointment forever. But yeah, so that is my tour. I love the Decemberists so very much. Obviously, you have to if you're going to devote this much time to it.
But if I was going to build a world around like the canon of music of an artist, like there's few other artists I would think of. Actually, many years ago, I mean, like I don't know, I must have been barely out of college, so we're talking about like 2003 or 4 or 5, 6, somewhere in there. Oh yeah, I guess more like 6. I played in just one session. It was just a one horror one-shot campaign that somebody based around the music of the Decemberists, and it was, I'm trying to remember which of their albums it was based off of, but it was like basically just the music of, it might have been Picturesque actually, that was just like, this campaign is, this one shot is completely inspired by the album Picturesque, and like the themes and the stories of the music will all be characters you'll meet and like will sort of be the story. So like when I found out that, you know, Illimat was coming out, I was very excited about that as a fan. But then like when I found out Skyjacks was going to be in a world inspired by Illimat and the Decemberists, I was like, there's nothing I could geek out more about, honestly, than this. It's such a great idea. But it's just such a rich canon of stories, and especially for, I guess we're fans, so it's hard not to, you know, we love it, this stuff. So.
Yeah, I mean, their music, my experience with music is a lot more informed and driven by lyrics. Those are, I think, the most important thing for me to determine whether or not I'll like something. And the lyrics in Decemberist songs are wonderful, and so much of what they do musically is exploring story. So they're just a band that's right up my alley. Yeah.
I mean, like you, I found them around the same time, like same album, like literally, but I went back and discovered like Castaways and Cutouts, and then I've like followed their career through, you know, since then. But during the pandemic, like they're a band that, going back, and like I really found Castaways and Cutouts again during the pandemic, and like for whatever reason, that album, just so many of the songs in that album, like just I latched onto during the pandemic. I don't even know why, but I just like latched onto them during the pandemic. But I was wondering, and you already kind of answered this, but whether a lot of your relationships to the songs has changed running the game, given like the character associations and story associations and things.
Definitely. Like in going through, like I listened to their discography several times through while I was preparing the setting. And some albums several times through, more than that, looking for characters, stories, images, different things that I felt would be good or compelling to see in a world of some kind. And definitely some jumped out to me more so than others. And those songs have taken on a new role sort of in my experience, in my life, because now it's attached to this story that I care very much about. So yeah, absolutely. My relationships have changed and evolved based on my experiences there.
So we're going to have to wrap this thing up at some point.
Yeah.
You've given me way more time than I could have ever asked for. Do you want to answer one more question? There was one more question in the chat.
Let's see
about here. Pirating. Well, go ahead. Whichever one you want to do. I just saw the one about pirating.
This one about pirating, I think makes sense. Hey, James, just wondering if there's any pirate lore or historical stuff you came across in your research and stuff that you're 100% against incorporating into the Skyjacks universe. Hey, this is a pretty easy question to answer. There is no sexual assault in Speir. I mean that not only will it not ever show up in the story, but it doesn't exist in the world of Speir, and there is a canonical story-based reason for that. I think it may have existed before the fall, but certainly not after. And that is partially because of my own experiences with sexual assault. But I hate some of like the leering storytelling that I see revolving around those themes. It pretty much always leaves a bad taste in my mouth whenever I encounter any story that centers that, because so many of them center it, I think, quite poorly. But it is very difficult to disentangle the history of piracy from sexual assault. Like, there are a lot of complicated forces in that, like colonizers were committing despicable acts throughout, and many pirates were colonizers. There is also a complicated relationship that piracy had with sex work. And, in a lot of aspects, that was actually pretty positive. There were sex workers working in places like Port Royal or Tortuga, right, where, pirates would go out, get rich, and then they'd go back to these places and they'd spend that money on sex workers until they ran out of money and had to go and get more.
Yeah.
Hey, what a great symbiotic relationship. It allowed those communities to flourish in what ways they could. But, we also can't pretend that is positive. Also, like in many of the raids that pirates were doing, sexual assault was not an uncommon practice. And on top of that, there are things like torture and whatnot. Those are things I very specifically did not want to engage with in my story because it's mine and I don't have to. I also wanted to specifically remove it in a way because one of the things that I want about Speir is kind of a harsh world. The water is cursed. The seasons don't flow in order. There's a lot of difficulty there, but where I can, I want to make it a kinder world than our world is. That's also one of the reasons that Heartroot Tea exists. Is like I want people to be able to have the experiences that they have in our world and in this world, but I want those experiences to be kinder and more within your control and fulfilling and whatnot. So that is why that is not incorporated. The other complicated part of that is right now I don't know how slavery, specifically chattel slavery, interacts with the world of Speir. The reason that I make a distinction there, most people think of slavery as one thing, and that is the style of slavery that was perpetrated here in the United States, where people were captured and brought against their will to be forced into labor. That is one of the faces of slavery that exists, but there was also indentured servitude, and that is a big part of the story of colonization as well. That is somebody falling into debt, and in order to work off that debt, they are literally forced into a labor situation, often as an accessory for travel too. Some people were just put into debt and then shipped off to labor in the New World. Other people specifically wanted to immigrate to the New World, but they didn't have the funds to do so. So they agreed to a term of indentured servitude where they would work for someone to work off that debt. Because slavery is very complicated, a very real and painful part of our history, and because I am very specifically not the person to write about it, I don't know how it is incorporated yet. That is going to be one of the things that I hire someone to write about, because I don't think you can talk about colonialism and the detrimental effects that it had on the world if you refuse to engage with slavery. But I don't feel comfortable addressing that yet. I do know that one of the coercive forces of capitalism employed by the Red Feather Syndicate is a form of indentured servitude. They control economies, they control debt and society in many ways. So they do set people up to fail in order to, legally seize them as property and then use them as forced labor for, some of their horrific endeavors around the world. So yeah, those are two things that one is a hard no, never going to show up. One is probably going to be addressed in different and complicated ways that I don't feel prepared to commit to yet, and will need some expert help in figuring out.
Great.
Yeah.
Great for the answering the question and for the question being asked. We said that was going to be the last one. I'm not even looking into the chat, so I don't get tempted. James, thank you so much for spending all this time on the show and getting so deep into the lore, and for everybody being here to watch. If folks want to make their own deep world for people to play in. If people want to world build similarly, they can go and buy the Ultimate RPG Game Master's World Building Guide by James D'Amato, which is out now. And they should, right? They should go buy the book.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one of the things, I'm not going to be able to tell you how to make a world exactly like Speir, because I don't think my methods could work for anyone else.
Right.
But what that book does have is prompts, exercises, and games that will help make the process of world building easier and more fun. There's also some advice in there too, but the focus is on putting tools in your hand to make like some of these things easier to approach. So if you like what I do on Skyjacks, I would recommend that you pick it up, because there's a lot of fun stuff in there that I think will, just make things easier for people to engage with and have fun with.
Awesome. And I hope people will. I'm going to be using it for some of my games and some of my actual play, and I'm excited about doing that. So I'm going to ask James to hang out in my little digital green room for a couple of minutes. I've just got a couple of things here so thank you, James, again. And I just have a couple of things I want to go over with folks real quick before I say goodbye to everybody. Thanks everybody for being here for this very special Holy Happy Hour Batman double shot that we've had going on tonight. I want to just point out a couple of quick things. I am still raising money for Trans Lifeline. I dropped a link in the chat to the fundraiser for that. I'm very excited to say that we've raised $300 this week for Trans Lifeline. My goal was $100. We raised $300, and I'm very thankful for that. So if there's anything that folks feel like they can donate at the last minute here before it ends, I think today's the last day for the fundraiser we set up. You can go ahead and use that link and give if you feel led to do that. And it's a really important cause that means a lot to me, and I hope you'll consider giving. Again, thank you everybody for being here. If you've never been on Holy Happy Hour before, if you've never seen my show, my stream, thanks for joining us tonight for this. I just want to highlight that I have two really exciting guests next week that I do not believe. Yes, so this is perfectly timed because Shabbat Shalom in the comments there. I appreciate you starting it with us also. We have next week two really fabulous guests, Gabrielle Rabinowitz and her cousin Ben, who I apologize to Ben, whose last name I don't remember. But Gabrielle is the game designer of Mod Nishtana. Why is this night different? She's a Jewish game designer, and they are specifically designing. We're going to be talking about designing from a Jewish perspective, and like the influence of Passover over that game and some other games that they're working on. And so we're going to be talking about all that stuff next week on the show. It's at 6 p.m. again here on my Twitch feed. If you're interested in more stuff about game design, and if you're interested in the religious intersections of game design from a particular perspective, that is going to be next week here on the show. So unfortunately, I don't think that my thanks for watching screen has the right ad for that. I'm sorry. I think it's still today's episode, which is going to go up in a second. But anyway, thank you all for watching. I hope everyone has a great night, and I hope to see you back here on the stream very soon. Bye-bye.